All right, wonderful. So today I'm going to be reading from a very particular book that goes by the name of Anti-Vaxxers: How to Challenge a Misinformed Movement. This is by Jonathan M. Bierman. Um, I am only going to read very particular chapters of this book because I think it should go over this stuff that's the most important. It's very easy to find online if you wish for it, though. So let me drag up my chapter here. Mhm, mhm. Chapter number 1, and I begin this by saying, TikTok, this is for educational purposes. I am reading from a book, and therefore it is okay by the community guidelines to be reading an educational book. 1, is there even a problem? Is the anti-vaccination movement even significant enough to pose a widespread threat to the public health? To answer that question, we must look at the actual immunization rates. If immunization rates were universally meeting targets and outbreaks of preventable disease were not occurring, then anti-vaccine activists would be unworthy of notice or response. As of 2016, immunization coverage in the United States exceed targets for immunization with diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, poliovirus, measles, mumps, and rubella, and HIV, hepatitis B, varicella, PCV, hepatitis A, and rotavirus. Coverage did not statistically change from 2012 to 2016. For most of these immunizations, coverage was above the target of 90%. But for immunizations required boosters during the second year of life, coverage was somewhat lower. The best predictors of immunization coverage were not membership in an anti immunization group, but access to medical care as determined by private insurance coverage, race, socioeconomic status. In the United States overall, rates of people seeking exemptions based on philosophical beliefs are low, and religious objections are even lower. Now, this book is a little bit older, and they explain in the beginning that this has changed. From 2011 to 2012, exemption rates for MMR vaccines were less than or equal to 2%. Rates from Europe are similar. Although more Europeans express skepticism about immunization, this was not in most cases translated into action significant enough to cause outbreaks. In France, as of 2016, 41% of respondents disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, overall, I think they are safe. Yet 96% of children were immunized against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. Children were immunized against measles. These numbers are lower than ideal, but not as bad as suggested by the level of doubt. The difference between immunization doubt and immunization rate is a gap between intent and action. This disparity between belief and behavior has been termed the intention behavioral gap or value action gap. Many of us experience such a gap in our daily lives. Most smokers know that smoking is bad for them, but smoke anyway. We know that driving above the speed limit is dangerous, but most drivers occasionally exceed speed limits. It isn't that smokers don't value their health, but various other factors enter into each decision to smoke. Likewise, there are many factors that affect the likelihood of an individual choosing to immunize. While the measles immunization rate in France should be higher, the French government is working to improve coverage. The factors affecting parents' decisions to immunize include more than doubts alone. Those immunizations that have faced difficulty achieving high coverage rates are often tied to other controversies of morality or identity. Gardasil, an immunization against some strains of the human papillomavirus, HPV, that causes almost all cervical and anal cancers, as well as the majority of vaginal cancers and cancers of tonsil, soft palate, and base of tongue, became very controversial after it was approved. Several largely Christian religious groups opposed adding Gardasil to routine immunization schedules on the basis that they believed it would lead to young women having premarital intercourse, which they opposed. Opposition to the HPV immunization is probably better explained by the moral and cultural identity of those opposing it than by opposition to the vaccination as a whole. The way that Gardasil was introduced by American Co. Inc. may have played a role in the controversy, as well as in reporting in the media that did not properly place the data at the opposition to the vaccine in context. Merck enacted a lobbying campaign in state legislators to make Gardasil mandatory for young girls. The campaign produced a very negative public reaction. By comparison, the Hep B immunization, which similarly treats STDs that can cause cancers, was introduced without much controversy and added to the routine childhood immunization schedule in the 1990s. By the way, I remember that because when I was in fifth grade, they paraded me into the nurse's office and I got all three of that particular series. And that was in the 90s. Woo! The way that immunizations are introduced, as well as the cultural competency of those introducing them to communities, plays a very important role in preventing hesitancy. Despite overall immunization rates in the United States, there are enclaves of anti immunization rhetoric that has taken root, and decreases in immunization rates have occurred, leading to outbreaks in some cases. As early as 2010, anti immunization activists were speaking to the Somali American community in Minnesota. Now, I am from Minnesota, and yes, I remember this occurring. In April through August 2017, there was a measles outbreak in Minnesota, the largest in 30 years, with 79 cases, most of them Somali American children. This outbreak had the potential to be far worse because measles immunization rates, while overall high, were much lower in some groups, such as private schools, where immunization coverage averaged only 83%. In a remarkable collaboration, public health officials worked with Somali Americans imams to conduct immunization campaigns. Between April and July 2017, more than triple the normal number of immunizations occurred in Minnesota clinics, and at the end of the outbreak, immunization rates remained higher than before the outbreak. These results suggest that culturally literate approaches to communities where immunizations have declined can be effective in fighting outbreaks. Reports at the time showed that people handing out flyers to spread anti-immunization conspiracy theories in the Somali American community, although anti-vaccine groups campaigning in the area denied the activity. Once again, I'm in Minnesota. I can tell you it happened. And by the way, continuing on TikTok, for educational purposes, I'm reading from a book. This is a book reading as approved by community guidelines. Continuing on. In another example, in 2014 through 2015, a measles outbreak occurred in California that spread to over 100 children, 45% of whom were unimmunized. In the news media, this became known as Disneyland outbreak. In California, rates had dropped from above 95% to about 92% in the prior decade, an effect attributed to the anti-activism. Following the outbreak, several public health measures were taken. A law, SB 277, made it more difficult to obtain non-medical exemptions for children entering public school, and the University of California system refused to accept unimmunized freshmen. As a result, childhood immunization rates have risen to above pre-2004 levels. However, some countries still lag behind in other rates because there is still a cohort of children who were never immunized under the previous rather lax criteria. I do have to change some of the words, and that's why I stutter, because of TikTok guidelines, which I'm also on. In 2019, an outbreak spread to over 1,000 cases, number much higher of these cases in the United States than in any previous year since measles was declared and eliminated in the country in 2000. The outbreak began in an Orthodox Jewish community in New York when an unvaxxed child returned from Israel carrying the virus. In Washington state, where Clark County saw 73 cases of measles, the state government passed House Bill 1638, which eliminated personal and philosophical belief exemptions in the state, but still allowed religious exemptions. We will see in a later chapter that religious exemptions are rarely based in the teachings of any religion and often invite parents to lie. In Rockland County, New York, a law banning unvaxxed minors from public spaces was passed. However, this ban was placed on a hold. As a part of the outbreak, a U.S. cruise ship operated by the Church of Scientology was quarantined due to measles risk, but later cleared. Despite the relatively high immunization rates in almost all countries with vaccine doubt, Ukraine stands out as an outlier with both high vaccine doubt and a drop in immunization rates for polio, measles, mumps, rubella to around 50%. This drop preceded a measles outbreak. In that country, immunization is required prior to school attendance. However, it is often seen easier to obtain a fake certificate than to immunize due to hospitals running low on free immunizations. This forced parents to face paying a high cost at pharmacies. More than half of the more than 40,000 cases of measles in Europe in 2018 were from that country. The decline in that country's MMR vaccine rates from about 95% in 2008 to 31% in 2016 was astonishing. And even the current population, this drop in immunization rates may have been caused in part by uh, their uh, there's several backed Twitter accounts from the country above them, I'll just say, that had spread misinformation about immunizations and to create false equivalency between pro and anti arguments. The biggest rate limiting factor to immunization is availability in many areas. Where availability is high, even though those with doubts tend to become immunized or have their children immunized. Whereas availability is impeded by cost or other impediments, immunization rates are lower. Thus, developing robust programs in countries with low rates is critically important response to reduce and prevent disease. Given its availability as the rate limiting agent, are anti vaccine activists even worth addressing? Peter Hotez, Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine, suggests that the countrywide data is limited and the state data should be considered. The basic reproduction numbers of measles and the number of cases generated by a single infection on average is 12 to 18. Some people may refer to R naught when you're talking about these conversations. It has a really high R naught factor. Okay. Uh, Basic reproduction numbers greater than 1 suggest that an infection will spread quickly. Less than 1 suggests that an infection is likely to die out. Measles' high basic reproductive number means that if the immunization rate in a group drops low enough, measles can spread rapidly. In certain Western states, non-medical vaccine exemptions have grown dangerously high. In Texas, the number of non-medical exemptions have grown to 45,000 children, a 19-fold increase since 2003. However, this data may underestimate the number of unimmunized children. From school-enrolled students, about 350,000 students in Texas are homeschooled. Some Texas schools have exemptions rates as high as 40%. If a measles infection spread in this population, the risk would not just be to children with non-medical exemptions, but especially to immunocompromised children, the unimmunized children's infant siblings who are far more vulnerable to hospitalization and death due to measles infection, the elderly and those who acquired immunodeficiencies, such as those undergoing treatment for cancer and those with AIDS and HIV. In addition, Hotez worried about the enclaves might become the sites of future outbreaks. Excuse me, my cat is requiring your love. Dear goodness, I'm over on the YouTube side too. Ugh. Anyway, dear God, my hair is just looking horrible today. My look at him, isn't he sweet? Aw, such a good kitty. All right, get back to business here. Do, 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 do. Anti-immunization activists have been successful in limited ways by establishing doubt within isolated communities. In the United States, when rates have dropped low enough in enclaves that an outbreak occurs historically, the reaction has been swift, culturally competent, and very effective in recovering vaccination rates. In absolute numbers, the number of children who have passed away because of these outbreaks in the United States is low. These data are heartening because they show the overall impact of the anti-immunization movement has been low. However, if you are a parent or relative of a child who does become infected with a immunization preventable illness, your child is still sick. If you are a parent whose child attends school, you will still have an interest in knowing that your community has a high immunization rate. If you're the parent of an immunocompromised child who is unable to immunize, membership in a community where immunization rates are high is an important step to protecting your child's life. The oscillations between minor outbreaks and adequate immunization rates is less desirable than eliminating those diseases or maintaining a high, steady rate of immunization. Public health efforts to eliminate diseases have so far been eliminated only in two worldwide: smallpox and renderpest. Now, this is one that's really interesting. If you guys don't know what that particular illness is, but yeah, we've done it twice. We've done it for smallpox and the other one that I just said, which is really interesting because they're like, what in the hell is that? Exactly. Absolutely, exactly. Oh, goodness. I lost my spot because I got excited about my cat here. Do, 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 do. Oh, rinderpest. There we go. There it is. The goal of eliminating polio by 2015 has been missed, and it seems unlikely to be eliminated by 2020. As of this book in 2025, we have not completely eliminated it. We have missed goals. Although the cases of wild polio have decreased to the low double digits, elimination still appears to be achievable in near term goal. And the sad thing is, like I said, this book came out and just it's hard. Uh-oh. So, guys, I'm just going to point out, um, I'm not only here on TikTok because the app has started like throttling things over on TikTok. I'm also on streaming this over on YT, YouTube. No, not YT, like white. I like YouTube, the other one. And if you can't see what I'm doing over here very well, that's fine. Move on over there. It's in the tree on my profile there. Just go ahead and move over if this isn't connecting well, because they'll do this. If I'm talking about a topic that is highly controversial to them, they'll throttle the internet. So I'm gonna kind of switch over my connection over here a little bit better. But if you're having a hard time, go to the other, because I'm running the YouTube off of my computer instead of the cell phone. So all right. We are talking about childhood immunizations with this book. If you want to get involved in one of my live reading off of Long Shot book, you can most certainly do that. I'm talking to the people over on TikTok for the one person here. But right now we're talking about childhood immunizations. Okay. I will also make note to anybody, if you do give gifts on any of the sites that I am on streaming, I don't take that. I give it to the ALS Association. Okay. So just to let you know, it's all ALS Association. I don't take anything from these apps. I do this all for free because I just like to. So by the way, look at the Kindle case that I got. Look how pretty it is. Look how pretty. Yeah, it's one of my favorites, I think. Allie, why is your Kindle so big for reading? Because I need glasses. I'm slowly going blind. Still love to read though. All right, so let's keep going on with the book. And of course, for all mod purposes, this is an actual book that I'm reading from. It's for educational purposes and is accepted by community guidelines, being as thus. All right. Do, 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 do. Yep. Because of the risks of the anti-immunization movement take place at the local level, local communities, schools, preschools, churches, mosques, synagogues, and neighborhoods, it is important to each of us knows how to understand the movement itself. We should learn the kinds of arguments it uses and how it spreads in communities and how it becomes associated with group identity. We should learn how we can individually respond to the doubts or questions of our friends, neighbors, and family members in a way that is compassionate, well informed, and correct. Anti immunization activism is a local problem and demands local and personal solutions. And I think they really spoke right here to that about how it is a group identity thing for a lot of these people. It does definitely becomes ingrained in their group identity, in their personal identity, into their religious identity, so on and so forth. So it's very important to meet those issues as we go about it. The great thing about this particular book Um, Anti-Vaxxers: How to Challenge Misinformed Movement by Jonathan Berman, is that after every chapter, it lists all the notes. They have active links. If you're doing it like on Kindle and stuff like that, you can click and see every single thing that they're talking about there. So, and they work. I clicked around in there, and yep, it's all there. So it's a really good one. I don't know if like my people over on YouTube can see, but there's like a whole notes section right there. It's huge. Anyway, continuing on. Oh, you said your little one in August? Ah, it looks like my little one's still napping, so we can continue on with our going to our next chapter here. And like I said, um, not only am I streaming here on the Clock app, I'm also streaming over on YTube over yonders in the tree. You can find me there too. Um, it's a lot harder to get people to watch the live over there. I don't have very fancy equipment for recording, so. But hey, you don't want fancy, you want education. Let's do it. Hello. We're reading this particular book. All right. Number 2, we're going to move on to understanding immunizations. And like I said, I do change a little bit of the wording for mod systems in each individual app. So if you hear me kind of changing a couple things around, that is why. Oh, yeah, I've got 3 of the little ones and stuff like that. I love all my children. Yeah. Chapter number 2. We first need to understand what immunizations are, a little bit about how they work, and the circumstances in which we should immunize. This book sometimes treats immunizations as a single action and immunizations as a single entity. Of course, this is not fully accurate. There is more than one kind of immunization, and immunizations may be targeted against infectious disease caused by bacteria, viruses, fungi, or animal parasites, or they may be targeted against cancers. Immunizations may be composed of many different substances and may be administered under very different circumstances. However, because of the anti-immunization movement often discusses immunizations as a single action, our discussion of immunizations will sometimes adopt this language so that we can discuss and address the movement's claims. An immunization is an agent that creates immunity against a disease-causing agent. We'll refer these as pathogens, without causing the disease itself. Immunity is a collection of defenses against disease causing organisms and materials, as well as cancer cells, that allow us to maintain protection against outside invasion. This system is both remarkable in efficiency with which it protects us and imperfect. Immunity begins with passive physical and chemical barriers that insulate our internal environment from the external. For example, the skin forms continuous barrier that is capable of preventing the majority of microorganisms from entering our bodies. Pathogens on the surface of the skin can dry out and can be attacked by the acidity of human skin. An invading pathogen must also compete with the natural flora that already populates the human skin. A classic experiment in introductory microbiology classes for undergraduates involves swabbing the skin of washed and unwashed hands and inoculating a plate of gelatin-like growth medium to characterize the growth of microorganisms that live on the skin in our daily lives. I remember doing this. It was crazy. The fact that unwashed hands can transmit disease was discovered in the 19th century and is still one of the major ways that disease spreads. In the mouth, salivary glands secrete mucus and proteins called immunoglobulins. I got it. Antibodies to trap and disable microorganisms that enter through the mouth or nose. Tears help wash away pathogens from the eyes. The acidity of the stomach is also able to unalive many microorganisms before they can colonize in the gut. Immune function in the body has 2 branches, the innate and adaptive immune systems. Often both work together to fight an infection. The innate immune system responds generally to the invasion and the bacteria, viruses, parasites, and does not need to be pre-exposed to the disease. The adaptive immune system recognizes particular bacteria, viruses, and parasites and generates the active responses to their presence. The adaptive immune system is what is made of by vaccinate. I had to reword this for the mods. The adaptive immune system is what is made use of by immunizations. This system recognizes infections that the body has already encountered and mounts a rapid defense against them, preventing illnesses from reestablishing infections once eliminated. The cell types of adaptive immune system are subdivided into T and B cells. B cells can be activated and have one of two fates. They can become a plasma cell, factories that continuously produce antibodies, or they become memory cells that remember a pathogen. When re-exposed to a pathogen, memory B cells can divide into plasma cells and more memory B cells. Immunizations operate by placing the body immune generating structures that are not capable of causing disease on their own. These might be fragments of unalived viruses or bacteria, a modified form of organism that are less virulent, or a related organism that cannot infect. These create memory B cells but do not create the disease. On first exposure, the immune system might take a week to ramp up production of antibodies. On later exposure, its response will be more rapid and more specific, ramping up production of antibodies within hours. To someone who has been immunized, exposure to a disease such as smallpox has a lower chance of the disease progressing to symptoms because antibodies will rapidly produce and the invader defeat. In this way, immunizations is making use of the body's normal defenses by exposing them to non-pathogenic versions of normally disease-causing organisms. However, in the case of infectious diseases, immunization is not just a process that happens to one person. Imagine a hypothetical immunization that reduces the likelihood of somebody who has received it from becoming sick when exposed to an infectious disease from 100% to 5%. The disease itself, once it has infected somebody, will average and infect 10 more people. Imagine that the recipient of the immunization lives in a village with 1,000 people. 10 of those 1,000 are immune compromised or too young to receive immunization. If only one immunization were available, we might expect these people to become sick because they are unprotected. The disease would rapidly jump from one person to 10 people to 100 to 999. Soon the entire village would be sick. If there were 800 immunizations available, you would expect about 240 people to become sick. These are the ones who were not immunized and those who were immunized, but in whom the vaccine did not produce immunity. What happens if 950 immunizations were made available? If we extrapolate from the previous examples, we might expect that 100 people would become sick, including those who are not immunized and those who are not able to make immunizations work. However, a phenomenon called herd immunity occurs when a large enough portion of the population is protected from the disease. When enough of the population is protected from the disease, the incidence of disease drops to the point where those who are vulnerable in the population are never exposed to it, because infectious diseases survive by moving from one person to the next. If the disease cannot find a new host, it cannot continue. No one other than the initial patient and perhaps one person with whom it has a chance encounter becomes sick. Reaching this critical threshold in a population protects those who cannot receive an immunization, which is why health officials often target immunization rates to exceed herd immunity thresholds. Once this threshold number exceeds, ongoing transmission of a disease can be ended. Efforts to eliminate diseases through immunization rely on herd immunity to end transmission of infectious diseases. The anti-immunization movement is comprised of people for a variety of reasons who have chose to oppose them. Often the movement is attributed solely to the developments as recent as late 1990s, but its origins go back much further to the origins of immunizations itself. Understanding how early anti-immunizations arose, as well as the arguments they made, will help us understand modern anti-immunization movement, because many of the arguments and motivations behind it have not changed. And when I say they have not changed, I mean it. They have not changed. The very arguments that were used by the individuals, and when we look at the history, probably in the next chapter, I'm going to suppose, these movements go back to Jenner. We can find examples of them in newspapers. We can find literature from them that go all the way back to the days of Jenner. How can you be a healthcare worker and drink one of these online? How can you do it? Like this. Oh no, shock. And off. Nope, the boy is still sleeping. Next chapter. So now we're going to go to chapter 3, the world before immunizations. A lot of people don't understand, because they've never seen these disease processes, why we started immunizing people in the first place. There was a very important reason we started to do so. And as I say for our moderators and whatnot, this is reading from a particular book. It's for educational purposes, and because of that is allowed by community guidelines. Continuing on. The world before immunizations. Upon the general calculation, 70 persons in every 100 have smallpox. Of these 70, 20 die of it in the most favorable season of life, and as many more wear the disagreeable remains of it in their faces so long as they live. Thus, a fifth part of mankind either pass away or are disfigured by this distemper. This was written by Voltaire. To those of us raised in the latter half of the 20th century or the early part of the 21st century, it is astonishing in the 18th century it was an inevitable fact of life that you were more likely to pass away from communicable diseases than from today's leading cause of unaliving, cardiovascular disease and cancers. In the world of the late 18th century, infectious disease was an inevitable feature of everyday life. The life expectancy at birth in England in 1750 was approximately 35 years. This low life expectancy was exacerbated by what is today an unthinkable infant mortality rate, so-called puerperal fever, a post-childbirth infection often spread by physicians, took many lives, and preeclampsia, hemorrhage, cephalopelvic disproportion were not understood or well treated, making birth a significant risk for the mother as well as the child. A life without major infectious illness was a luxury and a rarity. Or in other words, everyone's like, oh, the average life expectancy was about 35. Well, when we talk about averages, we take all the numbers and stuff like that, and we divide blah, 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 blah. It wasn't 35 because most people lived it was 35 because so many people died young. Like the infant mortality rate was so high that it like knocked down our life average to 35 years, which by the way is, that'd be like me going, man, I had a good run. Me in my mid 30s. I'm like, oh, that was a good run. Yeah. Anyway, the bubonic plague periodically unalived huge portions of the population of Europe. Outbreaks of cholera and typhoid regularly occurred, and smallpox was ever present. Not only was a disease rampant, but it wasn't understood. The discovery that diseases could be caused by microorganisms was a century in the future. Diseases were recognized and classified, but the medicine of the time was at best palliative and at worst did more harm than good. The first disease to be immunized against, and one of the first diseases to be investigated with early version of scientific method, was smallpox. Smallpox was a disease with a 30% mortality rate. That's nuts. Characterized by influenza-like symptoms followed by rashes, lesions on the skin, and mucous membranes, many survivors were left permanently scarred or unable to see. Possibly at the time, mortality rates were even higher because distinctions may not have been made between chickenpox and smallpox. It is believed that smallpox had blighted humanity since the earliest old world human agriculture civilizations, and characteristic lesions can be found or ever preserved on mummies of ancient Egypt. Smallpox cared not for social class, intelligence, race, piety, or prayer. Smallpox was egalitarian in its reign of unaliving and disfigurement until it was made into a biologic thing in Native American. I got to reword this for the app. It was made to unalive Native Americans in the United States by Europeans. There we go. That's the best way that I can word it without getting taken down. Unlike other diseases such as malaria, smallpox was not limited by climate. When an immune population would grow old and pass away, an epidemic would occur and once again unalive and disfigure anew. Smallpox was nasty and miserable, not a fun time at all. The disease gained its name variola from the same root as the English word of various. Various referring to the marks left upon the skin. Later, the field of virology was developed, and it became possible to classify diseases based on characteristics of the agent that caused them rather than the condition they produced. With smallpox, the condition was caused by a type of virus known as the orthopox virus. Using modern methods, we know that chickenpox, for example, belongs to a different family of viruses, despite carrying superficially similar symptoms, which is why the widespread immunization for smallpox did not eliminate chickenpox, chickenpox being varicella. There has not been a case of smallpox since the 1970s, and the only known examples exist in secure government research labs in the United States and Russia. The disease was declared eliminated on May 8th, 1980. Diseases such as whooping cough and measles are now so rare as to be considered remarkable, and the millions of dollars are spent every year researching ways to combat illnesses such as malaria and HIV. By the way, there are really, really good advancements for HIV. I'm astonished. The idea that humans can, through focused effort, develop and arrive at cures for diseases is a relatively modern thought and idea. For most of our history, the causes and mechanisms for diseases were not understood. Medicine was pre-scientific and included such treatments as leeches and blood drawing for a variety of conditions. One feature of smallpox that aided in its attempt for treatment is that once infected with smallpox, if a patient recovers, they are not later susceptible. Attempts were made to expose patients to smallpox as a way of preventing later infection in a process known as virilization. Oh, by the way, that just means they had smallpox parties. We'll just label it smallpox parties because that's interesting. Yeah. Usually cause mild smallpox symptoms followed by recovery. It is believed that the first variolation occurred in China or India through a process called insufflation, whereby ground smallpox scabs or pustule filled with inhaled through the nose. The texts refer to similar practice in India dating to the 16th century. The practice did not make it to European medicine until 1714. Although it was known by European physicians before that and commonly believed to be a folklore treatment. So basically what they would do is they would take a little bit of the stuff from the sores and stuff like that, or they would take the scabs and have them sniff it and whatnot to get a mild form of the illness, is what their logic was back in the day. Interestingly, the willingness of European physicians to ignore variolation mirrors the later resistance to immunization by some in the medical community. Regardless of when the practice entered the medical literature, there is evidence that it was widely known in practice for a long time before formalization in the early 18th century. It is possible that the practice had multiple origins and is far older than recorded accounts. However, when it was practiced, it had a very low mortality rate and was provided protection against smallpox. However, it did carry risk. Those who were inoculated became carriers, then who could infect others with a full case of smallpox, and in smallpox numbers of cases, it led to serious cases of smallpox. Or in other words, doing it this way may have been like better than full-on smallpox for the person doing it, but everybody else around them got really, really uber sick and not good. There needed to be a better way. It seems strange that the practice so widely employed wasn't accepted or known by the scientific and medical elite of the time. However, science at the time was in its infancy. Indeed, the term science has had meanings that have shifted and changed throughout the centuries and probably still has not settled. In 1834, can't pronounce his last name, horrible, was the first to use the term scientist. By analogy to terms such as artist to describe those who practice science, the Baconian method was first proposed in Francis Bacon's book Novum Organum in 1620. This was a landmark in the development of scientific reasoning for several reasons. It is one of the first time systematic method for acquiring knowledge about the world based on only observed facts rather than inference was proposed. The structure of observation followed by hypothesis followed by further observation is still an important way that science is conducted today. Although induction has been convincingly argued against as the sole means of acquiring scientific knowledge. In the 17th century, Newton, Leibniz, and Galileo were revolutionizing science. Descartes suggested a mechanical universe, and John Locke's writings influenced many to see knowledge as produced by human experience rather than metaphysical interference. Yet, germ theory of disease would not gain acceptance for hundreds more years. Voltaire wrote about how those who practice inoculation were viewed. It is inadvertently affirmed that the Christian countries of Europe and the English are fools and madmen. Fools because they gave their children to smallpox to prevent them catching it, and madmen because they wantonly communicate a certain and dreadful distemper for their children merely to prevent an uncertain evil. Since that, oh, goodness, that's pretty much talking about smallpox parties. Science was gaining in influence, but scientific method was, gotta reword it for the app. Science was gaining influence, but the scientific method that we now employ were not yet available. Statistical analysis was yet to emerge as a means of testing hypotheses, and the scientific norms such as journal publications and peer review did not yet exist. Often science proceeded in fits and started by individual efforts, but science as a collective enterprise was not recognizable. Moreover, the concept of science as a career in which one might devote one's time to earning money was seen as unseemly. Those who studied science saw themselves as liberally educated and holding broad interests, including philosophy and the natural world. This world of rampant disease, high infant mortality, and rising influence in the scientific ideas is the background to which the first immunization was discovered. To give the little bit of background there. So, wonderful. Also, I will make note and remind people that there are more ways to see me than just here on the Clock app. You can also head over to my link tree, and I am trying to stream over on the other app that's over there. You know, the tube, I'll just say. And you can also see how that goes over there. I can tell you it's not as fun. Like I can't pop up things on my YouTube like I can the other. I just maybe it's because I don't know what I'm doing yet with it. I don't know. But yeah. It's not as fancy, it's not as clear, but here we are. Yeah, looks like the little one is still napping, so we might be able to go one more. Nobody wants to read books anymore. Now we're going to get into the first immunization, the first vaccine. Chapter number 4. And science credit goes to the man who convinces the world, not the man to whom the first idea occurs. That's Francis Galton. For most of the modern era of medicine, we have considered viruses to be non-living. A virus is a fragment of genetic material called RNA or DNA encapsulated by a coat of protein, which may sometimes be modified by fats or sugars. Of the things that most scientists agree are characteristic of living things, viruses only exhibit a few. They do not metabolize, grow, or generally respond to stimuli. They do not reproduce, but by only infecting cells and hijacking their machinery, which is normally replicating RNA or DNA and produces proteins. Viruses evolve like living things, but because they are obligate parasites with no independent life cycle and they are viewed as living. DNA and RNA are molecules whose main function is to carry information in a stable and copyable manner. A sugar backbone holds interchangeable molecules, and the sequence of which can be interpreted by the machinery of the cell to produce scientific proteins. Proteins are also long chains built Lego-like from a limited number of molecules. The genetic material of a virus tells the cell which proteins to make to produce more virus and is duplicated into every individual viral particle produced by an infected cell. These duplications are often imperfect and introduce errors into the virus produced by that cell. These errors are known as mutations. The two most common fates for mutated viruses are either that the mutant has no change in its ability to infect cells and reproduce, or that it becomes less efficient or unable to reproduce. These mutations are less fit to reproduce and do not survive. Rarely, but occasionally, a mutation increases the ability of a virus to infect some cell types and reproduce more. Because of these viruses are better fit for their environment, they enjoy easier reproduction and therefore will often outcompete their less well adapted counterparts. Viruses will often evolve along divergent paths and with different strains to become better fits for different environments, such as different host species or cell types. Smallpox shares an evolutionary ancestor with another virus known as cowpox. Cowpox infects udders of cows and produces lesions similar to those of smallpox. It is also zoonotic, meaning it can be transmitted between humans and non human animals. Because humans are not its primary host, cowpox presents much milder symptoms into infected humans that does smallpox and is generally not lethal to humans. Another important feature of cowpox is that it shares molecular similarities with smallpox and looks very similar to smallpox to the human immune system. This information about viruses was unknown in the late 18th century, but in 1768, the surgeon John Fuster started a practice with local inoculator and made an observation. Some people, although repeatedly exposed to smallpox, did not develop any symptoms despite never having the disease. As an explanation, a farmer suggested to him, I have had the cowpox lately to a violent degree, if that's any odds. Investigating, Fuster discovered that all those whom he did not inoculate with smallpox at some point had cowpox. He did not, however, see the point of using cowpox as a substitute, as he believed smallpox inoculation to be well understood. Remember, I always say, if what you're doing isn't working to the best of the ability, we need to try better. We need to figure out something else, right? This guy was like, meh, we don't need to figure out anything else. We got this. Okay. Remember, kids, the only difference between screwing around with science is writing. Okay. Sorry. This is a fun quote, so I'm going to say it again. Remember, kids, the only difference between screwing around and science is writing it down. That's Alex Jason. It's often attributed to Adam Savage, though. That's a fun quote. I like that. In nursing, we call it write it down or it didn't happen. Another reason that Fuster is not credited with the discovery of vaccination is that although he made the initial observation and reported it, he did not undertake the systemic way to test it. In fact, several people recorded attempts to use cowpox as a means to inoculate against smallpox. Peter Plett, a German teacher, was probably the first to recognize the importance of the discovery and reported his findings to the medical faculty at the University of Kiel. Those faculty favored variolation, so the report was never forwarded. Plett was rarely credited. Or in other words, they're like, meh, what we're doing, we'll just keep on keeping on. Once again, it was not necessarily very safe. And all these other people are like, hey, we've got a safer way to go about this. Let's try that. And they're all like, meh. Indeed, as many as 6 people before Jenner, who is often credited with the discovery of vaccination, made this observation. Although we think of the scientific discoveries as belonging to individuals, it is often the case that attributing appropriate credit is a messy and a difficult thing. Jenner was the first to popularize the discovery and is therefore given credit for it. For many discoveries, the credit is hotly debated, as in the cases of Rosalind Franklin, whose contributions to the discovery of the structure of DNA were not recognized until after her death, and Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who, as a postgraduate student, made the observation that led to the discovery of pulsars, but not included in the Nobel Prize awarded for it to her thesis supervisor and other workers of the paper. The stage was set for Jenner's work on vaccines by a number of figures and discoveries that occurred in the 17th century. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu is credited with introducing the practice of virolation to England, although she cannot be said to have discovered it. She traveled to what is now Turkey and wrote to a friend about it being used on the Ottoman court. Upon returning to England, Lady Montagu introduced it to the royal physician, who then experimented on 6 prisoners in 1721 on the promise of a full pardon. Or, in other words, he's all like, "Can I test this?" And they're all like, "It's on prisoners. Yeah, we'll let it slide." Lit. This experiment was observed by the members of the Royal Society. Later, he experimented on 6 orphans in London. That monster. I'm not being facetious. That monster in London, and finally on the children of the Princess of Wales. Notice he went to the prisoners, the orphans, and then he attempted with the higher ups. He's all like, not touching that. Human experimentation, also performed by Jenner, was not at all time governed by the same ethical rules that it is now. Today, offering pardon in exchange for being a subject to potentially deadly experimentation treatment or experimenting on children would be seen as hideously unethical and would never pass review, as I just got done saying. WTF. The first recorded intentional immunization with cowpox occurred 2 days before Jenner's work. Benjamin Jesty, a farmer, used cowpox to vaccinate his family. In 1774, smallpox was noted near his farm. He used a darning needle exposed to pus from the infected cow to scratch his wife and children. Their wounds became inflamed, but all survived. Later in 1789, his children were inoculated with smallpox, but did not display reaction. According to a physician who wrote of the attempt in 1803, the boldness and novelty of the attempt produced no small alarm in the family and no small sensation in the neighborhood. The inflammation of the wife's arm produced such an upset that a neighboring surgeon almost lost his patience when proposing a follow-up experiment to Jesty's. There was an objection to introducing the bestial disorder to the human frame. Jesty was credited with resisting the clamorous reproaches of his neighbors. So this farmer, right, salt of the earth farmer, is all like, dang, that smallpox be coming. But let's try this. And all of his family survived. And people were like, I don't remember this guy. What was his name? Jesty. His name is Jesty. And he had to try and convince his neighbors that he did the right thing. Anyway. Remarkably, this was the first recorded instance of vaccination, also marked the first recorded instance of opposition to immunization. Although in this case, the reasoning behind the opposition was likely sound. With no medical training or equipment, Jesty had used a darning needle to infect his family. That's crazy, but yeah, worked. An experiment resulting in alarming infection. This was also the first instance of what would become a running theme in history: revulsion and visceral horror at the mere notion of polluting one's body with alien materials, quote unquote. Concerns about safety and fear of taking foreign material into the body often still characterizes anti-immunization rhetoric 250 years after Jesty's bold experiment. It's a very common argument I hear from individuals, by far. Ultimately, Edward Jenner was credited with the discovery of vaccination because he would be the first to systemically test the idea that exposure to cowpox would prevent later smallpox infection. During his childhood, Jenner was inoculated against smallpox. He became a physician. Before his work on vaccines, he was elected to the Royal Society, and most important, the scientific body of the time in England, for the study of cuckoos, showing that when cuckoos laid eggs in the nests of other birds, it was not the parent cuckoo who ejected the eggs of the parasited birds from their nests, but the newly hatched cuckoo. Fellowship of the Royal Society was amongst the era's greatest scientific honors. Jenner began understanding that domestication of animals had exposed humans to animal diseases, and certain infections would be transmitted from animals to humans. He then made essentially the same observation that others before him had, that milkmaids who have contracted cowpox did not react to inoculation with the reduced course of smallpox infection. This observation led to the formation of a hypothesis that inoculation with cowpox acted similarly to inoculation with smallpox to provide protection against later smallpox infection. Jenner meticulously collected case reports that seemed to support the idea. He had his inoculated patients if they had ever had cowpox, and he recorded the results of the inoculation with smallpox. observing that consistently, those patients who had been exposed to smallpox were unaffected by cowpox and vice versa. The distinguishing feature that Jenner brought to vaccination was the systemic attempt to collect individual anecdotes. This is a more scientific than a single unreported experiment, as Benjamin Justy traded on his family. Happening at the dawn of the scientific era, vaccination grew up at the same time that science did. Jenner also relied on human experimentation in a way that would not be permitted today. He learned the scientific method as why think, why not try the experiment? After assuring himself that folk wisdom of cowpox preventing later infection by smallpox was true, he did the experiment. In May 1796, Sarah Nelms, a dairy maid, was infected with cowpox in a scratch on her hand. Jenner then found a healthy boy from about 8 years old to experiment on. The matter was taken on a sore hand of a dairymaid who was infected by her master's cow, and it was inserted on the 14th of May, 1796, into the arm of a boy by means of two superficial incisions, barely penetrating the skin, about half an inch long. After the infection with cowpox ran its course, Jenner inoculated the boy with smallpox from a fresh pustule, July 1st, 1796. This weak case of smallpox, normally observed after inoculation, did not occur. Several months after, Jenner tried again to infect the boy and found similar results. If it seemed unethical to experiment to infect healthy children with the disease to satisfy one's personal curiosity as it is, the best that can be said without excusing the behavior is that Jenner would have likely inoculated the boy with smallpox regardless of this experiment. Inoculation was a practice Jenner was very familiar with and believed he could do safely, despite the procedure's low mortality rate. He knew that cowpox could be non-fatal, so the minor suffering of cowpox seemed to him worth the possibility of avoiding the 3% risk of unaliving from variolation. At this point, Jenner was delayed for 2 years as he was unable to refrigerate or store viruses until cowpox infections were once again available. In March 1798, he inoculated two 5-year-old children. One became sick with a fever that Jenner attributed to the child being in a workhouse. The other provided material to inoculate the other boy, who displayed the fever consistent with smallpox, but not the pustules. Emboldened, in April, Jenner inoculated several more children with cowpox. Most of these cowpox inoculations were followed with the attempts to inoculate these patients with smallpox. The name Jenner gave the process was vaccination, from the Latin word vacca, meaning cow. Opposition to the idea of vaccination was swift. Jenner's original paper was rejected by the Royal Society as being too fantastical, and in opposition to what... give me a second here, guys. Yeah, it's going to make me do a puzzle piece. There we go. They made me do the puzzle piece thing over there. How dare they? How dare they? The other app I'm streaming on doesn't make me do that. If I'm sitting here and I'm reading and I'm actively engaging, you think that they wouldn't care so much. Oh, well, we're going to continue. Opposition to the idea of vaccination was swift. Jenner's original paper was rejected by the Royal Society as known as being too fantastical and in opposition to what was previously known. But he published his results in a booklet. Jenner's work was seen not only as blurring the line between human and beast, but between social classes. It was shocking that information gleaned from pastoral farmers and milkmaids might advance medical science, which was considered to be the domain of educated elite. Those with economic interests in violation were especially doubtful of the new technology. Or in other words, the people that were doing the other procedure, that violation, was like, dude, we making money off of this, and we don't want Jenner's product and whatnot to mess with this. That's basically what it was back in the day. It's not that science isn't good or people can't do new science. It's that corporate greed is bad. There you go. There's your lesson. Corporate greed is bad. Greed be bad. Can any person say what may be the consequence of introducing a bestial humor into the human frame after a long lapse of years? Who knows? Besides, the idea may arise in the course of time from a brutal fever having excited its incongruous impression on the brain. Who knows? Also, that the human character may undergo strange mutations from the quadruped sympathy, and that some modern fasfe may rival the fables of old. Okay, if you didn't understand what I was saying there, basically there was a person that was all like, "Oh my goodness, they're infecting people with cowpox from a cow. Are they going to turn into one?" Does that sound familiar to other claims that are made maybe today, maybe something that you might have heard of in recent history? Because these types of arguments have been made for a long time, a long, long time. So it's very surprising to me that people don't see that. I'm going to move this over a little bit. Move it. All right, there we go. There. Huh. I'm going to see something here real quick. You know what? Aw. One person had a like on this. Wonderful. So nice. I was looking over on the other app. By the way, it's always important that if you're able to go over to the other app that I'm streaming on right now, that you also give that a try and stuff like that. That way, if something happens here, you can still find me over there. And I do believe it's in my link tree. If you guys aren't already over there, the quality isn't as good at this point because I'm running it off of my laptop camera. But you still hear me, you still see me, you still are hearing the same book. Were the Capulets and the Montagues were arguing about immunizations back then? No, I didn't say that. But I'm just saying that there are people with that last name. And actually, the name that I was saying did not have an E at the end of it. It was just GU, by the way. As vaccination gained traction, so did the opposition to it. Pamphlets were distributed opposing immunizations and comparing it to opposing Napoleon's army. Vaccination was framed as a foreign assault on traditional order. However, this early opposition was recognized as hyperbolic and rejected by the medical community. Jenner shrewdly became an influence campaign. He met with the king, the prince, and finally the queen of the United Kingdom, using their approval to speed adoption among the elites from whom it spread in their tenets. Jenner made a political decision to ally himself with the establishment forces in order to speed the adoption of vaccination. Adoption of vaccination was not immediate in the medical community, but by 1840 it had supplanted variolation, which was outlawed in England with the British Vaccination Act of 1840. And this part was triggered by the news of 1837 outbreaks of smallpox carried by fur trader into the American West. More than 17,000 people passed away, possibly double this number, many of them Native Americans. A full accounting was never made because at some point the bodies could no longer be counted. Over the following century, the Act of 1840 and a series of laws passed in 1853, 1867, 1871, 1873, 1889, 1898, and 1907 laid out by UK policy regarding vaccines. The Act of 1840 provided optional free immunizations in addition to outlawing variolation. Importantly, this created a public vaccine service which survived for decades. The Act of 1853 triggered the first formal organized opposition to vaccination. So it goes back quite a bit of ways. But immunizations were something that were created quite a while back. We have accounts of processes that they used prior to vaccination to inoculate people for smallpox that were way more dangerous and eventually were outlawed and banned because of how dangerous they are compared to immunizations. And here's the thing, and I've noted it when I was reading the book there. The inoculations that they were using that they outlawed because they were so dangerous were still safer than getting the actual disease process themselves. So if they're sitting there and they're like, oh, doing this is safer than disease process itself, and then they turn around and they're like, actually, vaccination is even safer than that process, you think there'd be a reason for it. Because they were sitting there like, man, we do it the safe way of our time, and it's like a 3% unalive rate. And then like immunizations come out and Jenner's like, check this out. And they're like, awesome. Let's outlaw this other one. But yeah, I will say that um, Jenner was not the last person to experiment on kids or family members or people. I believe the boy that they talk about in the book was one of the kids of one of his like helpers, one of his servants or something like that, if I remember more correctly. So, yeah, they're all like, "Is it safe?" And he's like, "Bet." He did it. Listen for my kid real quick. Kids always come first. I like doing this. I like reading for you. I like spending time with you, but my boy will always come first. He's slowly starting to get better, though. He was sick for over a week. It was horrible. Absolutely horrible. We still don't know exactly what caused it, but he's finally starting to eat again and move around. So that's good. Yeah. 5, the first anti vaccine movements. This is where we're going to get into a little bit of the history here. Early opposition to immunizations was intimately tied to the issues of social class, individual liberties, and individual collective rights, and changing ideas about health and medicine. While many disliked the idea of vaccination in its first decades, organized opposition to the practice of vaccination was not common until the British government began mandating it. One of the things that I say about the 6 themes of mis and disinformation is that one that is found on the 6 themes is my freedoms. Okay. So that's number 2, my freedoms. You don't need all the other things on the 6 of the like the other 5 themes of disinformation out of the 6 are not necessary for that theme to occur. And that theme is not necessarily needing to be in the other 6 in order for disinformation to occur. My freedoms as number 2 is like something on its own merits. People can believe disinformation off of number 2, my freedoms alone. They don't even need all the rest of this stuff. My freedoms can cause disinformation all on its own merit. Okay. So, because of the Vaccination Act of 1853 requiring mandatory immunizations for all infants over 4 months old, it raised issues of civil liberties and numerous civic and religious concerns about bearing the cost of immunizations for the poor. I'm going to read that again. Okay. And I really want you guys to hear what I just said. It raised issues of civil liberties and numerous civic and religious concerns about bearing the costs of immunizations for the poor. They didn't want to immunize the poor. Gosh, spend money on the poor. Oh, God forbid. Jesus wouldn't want me spending money on the poor, would he? About placing materials from cows into humans, about preserving the integrity of the body, and about disrupting the natural order of those who believed in the power of immunization to improve human health and well-being on the right of the state to impose immunizations found themselves in a war with both information and culture. The philosophy of health for many simply did not include the scientific experimentation or analysis. The emerging field of the science-based medicine was in competition with the alternative approaches, such as homeopathy, heroic medicine, and folk medicine, absent the rigor of experimental and scientific approaches to understand disease. Such as alternative approaches were appealing. Indeed, even those administering immunizations in that era did so in a way that we would now consider to be unsanitary, painful, and sometimes disfiguring. And this is reading from the book for educational purposes and therefore accepted by the community guidelines. Trigger warning, some stuff coming up. Pus would be taken with a tool called a lancet from the pustule of one of the vaccinated individuals and used to vaccinate the next. This is highly unsanitary and is not done at all anymore. This is mortifying. Colonial powers would impose vaccination on unwilling populations. Vaccine material would be collected from sores of infants who had recently been immunized. These practices possibly transferred other communicable diseases. At the time, poorer economic classes often did not have access to clean water or wound care, and secondary infections could develop from immunizations. Those who believed that health was maintained through integrity of the body saw compulsory immunizations as an outrageous overreach of the state into personal affairs. Those living in colonies of the era often saw immunizations as just another means for controlling and dominating the population. A person's body was the last battleground where individual freedoms would be faced off and the growing authority of the state. During the same century, a series of acts seemed to assert the rights of the state over the bodies of especially the poor and the women. The Autonomy Act of 1832, which was intended to prevent the shortage of available bodies for dissection in the studies of anatomy, expanded the range of usable corpses from only those executed unalivers to those whose remains were never claimed. In the view of many, the act allowed the wealthy to dissect the poor. The Contagious Disease Act required medical inspection of those suspected of being ladies of the night in order to look for a venereal disease, regardless of their consent. Much of the prevalent anti-immunization sentiment of the era was laid out in 1854 when John Gibbs, Esquire, published the booklet Our Medical Liberties or the Personal Rights of the Subject as infringed in recent proposed legislation, comprising observations on the Compulsory Vaccine Act and the Medical Registration and Reform Bills and main laws. By the way, for a title of a writing, holy buckets, that was like, oh, that's a huge title. Most people would have been like, I ain't reading this these days if they would have read that title. Damn, that's a title. He was in favor of neither compulsory immunization or short titles. This was actually in the book. I just said that too. Yeah. He was in favor of neither compulsory immunization nor short titles. And that's true. That title I just read off. Ooh. Gibbs attacked the Immunization Act of 1853 on several fronts, complaining that it was an intrusion of personal rights and that it was written on the benefit of medical trade and that it treated populace as too silly to make their own health decisions, that it mandated a practice that was not universally accepted amongst physicians, and that it failed some individual cases. Notice all the arguments that you hear today. The similarity of his pamphlets' arguments to those made by modern immunization opponents is striking. Gibbs went on to make a much weaker argument in the light of modern scientific knowledge. He argued that the fundamental nature of human biology and therefore of disease changed intermittently and that the scientific studies of disease were therefore useless. He argued that immunization, regardless of its protective effects against smallpox, might have influence generally upon the constitution. Does it lower the vital resistance and predispose the system to receive, or does it introduce it to another form of disease? His complaint that immunization benefited the medical trade may have been related to his own occupation in hydropathy, a kind of quack medicine that involved treatment by bathing and drinking or injecting in water, applying it to various parts of the body. Given the hygiene practices of the area, promoting bathing was perhaps not the worst idea that he had, but was not an effective means of preventing smallpox infection. A similar tension exists today. Science-based medicine exerts a monopoly on the treatment of a disease, and its periphery alternative practitioner market non-evidence-based approach to health care. At the same time as vaccination was developing, so was the new science of statistics. In the modern era, statistics is its own mathematical science with a number of well-understood methods and ways of formalizing results. Statistics started in a way for states to collect information about populations living in them for analysis. The fundamental problem with statistics solves is that it is difficult or impossible to survey every member of a population for every parameter that you might want to test. For example, if you want to know how many men wear hats in the United States, you could survey every man in the United States, or you could attempt to get an estimate by surveying a subset of men. Statistics allow us to decide how many men to survey, how likely our results are to represent the entire US population, and how much we should trust our results based on that data. The development of probability theory allowed for the use of testing hypothesis by statistical means. There's a possibility, for example, that if you pick 10 American men at random to survey, and you have had bad luck of picking 10 hat wearers or 10 non hat wearers by random chance, statistic allows us to estimate the probability of having a representative sample. It also allows us to estimate the likelihood that two measured groups are different because of random chance rather than actual difference. If we sample 10 people from New York and 10 from San Antonio and then find 10 hat wearers in New York and only 5 in San Antonio, statistics will allow us to know if we had sampled enough people from each city to draw a reasonable conclusion. However, statistics can be deployed badly or in bad faith. The often complex looking equations and symbols of statistics can be used to communicate quickly and succinctly between those of statistical training, and they can be used to confuse, befuddle, and bully into belief those without. Gibbs' booklet provides examples of the latter approach. By selecting only data that seemed to be supportive of his views, a kind of bias that scientists often call cherry picking, he could imply alarming trends. A rise of unaliving rates due to measles in specific cities can be attributed to immunization by means of confusion between correlation and causation. These same means of representing statistical information are still used today by modern immunization activists. To understand the reaction of the Vaccination Act of 1853, we need to consider it a political context. John Locke's writings on natural rights were still influential at the time. Locke proposed that what we call natural rights, as distinct from legal rights, which were rights belonging to every human that could not be altered by human laws. Locke identified these as life, liberty, and property. An alternative view, also circulating at the time, was proposed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You know what? I'm getting tired. That's what it is. The social contract. Rousseau proposed that the right of the people to be governed should come from agreement between the government and the governed rather than the divine and mandate. Everyone ought to give up the same rights to government and assume the same duties. Thomas Hobbes supported the line of thought, arguing that if humans are born with the natural rights to take any actions, those rights lead to a war against all, to compete for resources and safety. Therefore, humans must give up most of their rights in order to live amongst other humans. It was in this background of competing ideas about the rights of individuals and the rights of the collective in the form of government that these early vaccines objections occurred. We still debate the boundaries between individual and collective rights today, and these debates inform our modern political philosophies and motivations. Setting aside these questions of whether the government had the right to impose immunizations, Gibbs brought forth the questions of whether vaccines worked, which was easier to answer with the emerging fields of science and mathematics. Success had recently had in using science to prevent cholera. The Public Health Act of 1848 was created to combat cholera epidemics by improving sanitation and the supply of water and establish general boards of health to oversee local boards of health. These boards would take over public sewers, purchase private sewers, institute street cleaning, and provide public lavatories and supply water. This process was pioneered by John Simon, a surgeon who had appointed as medical officer of the Health of London, chief medical officer of the General Board of Health, and later chief medical officer of the Privy Council. Simon was a strong advocate for vaccination and presented a strong rebuttal to claims by anti-vaccine activists that vaccination did not work. Simon wrote, "Hence, in the middle of the 19th century, the very success of vaccination may have blinded people to its importance. It is so easy to be bold against an absent danger, to despise the antidote while one has no painful experience to the bane." Meh. Simon presented to Parliament and the Queen papers, making an extended argument in favor of vaccination. He detailed the history of its opposition, commenting, "It is worrisome to work to read stuff so stupid and so dishonest." In response to the claim that vaccines were causing people to become cow-like, burst forth with horns, or behave in a beastly manner. He also pointed out that the disagreements by medical professionals tend to amplify dissenting voices, but by and large, the opinion of the medical professionals had been fixed since the earliest part of the 19th century. Remarkably, he made statistical arguments not only that vaccination had reduced unalivings by smallpox tenfold to 20-fold, but in the exceptional cases where immunization did not prevent a later disease, the severity of the disease was likely to be mitigated. He cited the work of the surgeon of London Smallpox Hospital, showing a fatality rate of 35% in the unvaccinated and 0.5% in the vaccinated. Furthermore, he showed that the revaccination worked to protect the majority of those who had once again become susceptible, debunking the idea that vaccination itself was causing harm. Simon showed the overall death rate had declined to the years since the discovery of the vaccination. Well, the thing is like a lot of the things that they bring forth in anti-immunization arguments uh, came from this time period of the 1800s. Um, and it's very fascinating to me that these arguments are still being replayed over and over and over again. But I mean, like, I wish I could show people over on YouTube and whatnot some of the photos that uh I have of this particular thing. Maybe I'll have to make a downloaded video and put it over there. But like back in the day, they had whole political cartoons of like people turning into cows because of Jenner's invention. It was so bizarre, the things that they would say people would do. And like I was reading, like the most that some of these scientists could do would be like, "Are you really believing that? That's so silly. Why would you believe something so silly?" What is even more bizarre to me is that people got angry about the thought of uh, the society potentially having to pay for healthcare for somebody lesser than themselves. That blows my mind. And it was also amongst people of the church of the time. They're like, oh, we can't give healthcare to the poors. What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? We have a bit of really good graphs that are in this book too. Um, it is absolutely amazing the work that this person has done on this book. However, Simon made a mistake that has become frequent among vaccine advocates. He focused only on scientific challenges, and denialists offered and did not make an effort to address the true underlying reasons for their concerns. Gibbs and other anti vaccine activists did not make scientific objections because they had approached the question with an open mind, and through scientific inquiry, they had decided that it was ineffective. They started with a complex network of personal reasons for objecting to vaccination and approached the science as a source of prestige that would be borrowed for their arguments. From this viewpoint, no experiment can be done well enough, designed enough, no controls adequate, and no evidence convincing. The effectiveness of immunization was beside the point, a mere rhetorical tool to be wielded by whoever was most convincing. The theme of anti vaccine advocates reaching into their conclusions for reasons other than scientific analysis and not changing their views at the face of scientific evidence is a reoccurring one. Basically, what they're saying here is no study will ever be done well enough, no sample will ever be big enough. There is no bit of scientific evidence that will ever convince these individuals, even if they're shown. I will say, out of the about 4 years I've been on social media educating the public to immunizations, that tends to ring true. It doesn't seem to matter how many studies I place in front of people, et cetera, et cetera. There are other arguments that they are utilizing, even if they're faced with hard evidence and proof of things being effective, safe, good for the general population. That goes out the window because the other concerns are kicking in. Simon was a founder of the Epidemiological Society of London, founded to viente occurrite morbo, or confront the disease at its onset. Gosh, forsaken Latin, why do you have to be so difficult? The society had a bold mandate to use the developing tools of science to study epidemics and become a better understanding of the origin and causes. This society signaled a shift in belief about disease from seeing it as a mysterious force that was largely outside human control to seeing it as a natural and mechanical phenomenon that could be analyzed and understood. One of society's founder, John Snow, no, not from that show. There's an actual guy named John Snow. No, we're not Game of Thronesing it. That's his actual name. Continuing on. Famously using statistics in 1854 to study the Broad Street cholera outbreak, which unalived 31,000 Londoners. By treating the water with chlorine and removing the handle of the water pump that was the source of the infection, he ended the epidemic. Hold on. We're going to back up a second because there are a lot of people who are upset what we do with water sources, especially in certain areas. And I need you to hear this one more time. Okay. He famously used statistics in 1854 to study the Broad Street cholera outbreak, which unalived 31,000 Londoners. By treating the water with chlorine and removing the handle of the pump where the source of the infection was, he ended the epidemic. We're going to continue on. This work convincingly showed cholera as a waterborne and not caused by miasma, and was chronicled in a 2006 book, The Ghost Map by Stephen Johnson. In the same year, an Italian physician observed a small organism living in cholera causing water, which he believed to transmit the disease by acting on the intestine. His theory was later proved correct as he proposed a treatment of an injection with electrolytes and water to supplement losses due to diarrhea. The Epidemiological Society of London was a symbolic of two trends, one towards professionalization of medicine and another toward development of medicine as applied science. The distinction amongst natural scientists, formal scientists, and social scientists and applied scientists had not yet been made in the minds of those who did scientific work or in the mind of the public. Broadly speaking, a natural science is a science that studies the natural world and seeks to understand its underlying rules and mechanisms, while an applied science applies knowledge and gained through scientific methods to solving problems in the world. However, the idea that medicine should be based only on which can be experimentally verified was novel. Those who claim to cure and treat diseases practiced without licensure and might use any number of methods and modalities. The idea of physician as a member of a professional class was unusual. It seemed to be a way for those with the means to make even more away from the common people. In many ways, these objections were all well founded. In the early 19th century, the physicians who would evolve into being members of the medical profession we now recognize were a little better than quacks and offered a variety of services and cures that we now recognize as being abject nonsense. Professionalization provided a means to control not only who could call themselves physicians and administer treatments, but also the quality of those treatments and the means of deciding how we use them. When the Vaccination Act of 1853 was being considered, the Epidemiological Society of London had a great deal of influence on its creation. Rather than known community members administering variolation, in the often ritualistic and comforting setting, strangers asserting all authority and state were performing a procedure. Given the condition of the medical profession in the early 19th century, riddled with pseudoscience and quack practitioners, a primary motivator of this professionalization was the desire for a return on investment. Why pay for medical school if someone with no education could still practice just as easily? The Medical Act of 1858 established a council for education and registration of medical practitioners. This granted medicine one of the central features of profession, self-regulation. To this day, some see the requirement that healers be educated as an unfair imposition that creates a monopoly. The alternative are treatments that have not been met by standards of scientific rigor and reproducibility necessary to be considered a medicine. A side effect of professionalization was the development of professional ethics. Professional ethics is a mean by which a medical practitioner can exert influence and control over the behavior of the peers in the line of agreement of coded ethics. To this day, medical ethics are influenced by the work of Tom Percival, who first published medical ethics in 1803, where he wrote, "The feelings and emotions of the patients under critical circumstances require to be known and attended to, no less than the symptoms of their diseases." Social and political class divides in the era of Victorian England were stark. Thomas Malthus published in 1798 an essay on the principle of population, which proposed a troubling idea. In essence, he argued that populations tended to grow in size over time. Because populations grow, they must consume more resources over time. But given that a certain resource is limited, Malthus proposed that so long population growth continues, the scarcity of resources could cause an ever greater poverty until incentives to have more children were reduced and the population once again stabilized. In this view, population would oscillate between growth when new resources became available, stable equilibrium when not. Among Malthus's suggested solutions was a proposal of elimination of social programs aiding the poor. If poverty was so miserable, then it was not possible to reproduce, he reasoned, and fewer poor people would have children. It was a type of eugenics back in the day, basically, in a nutshell. Malthus's idea was deeply influential, as were those of David Ricardo publishing on the principles of political economy and taxation, which argued that taxes raised for the relief of poverty reduced the funds available to pay wages and encouraged laziness. Gosh, that sounds familiar. Another influential thinker was Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was an early advocate for women's rights, abolition of slavery, abolition of death penalty, animal rights, and gay rights. He was also an atheist who opposed the idea of natural rights as granted by divine power and therefore disliked the American Declaration of Independence, which borrowed heavily from Locke's ideas. Bentham's major philosophical stance is known as utilitarianism. I'm a type of utilitarian. I get it. Which is the view that the moral rightness of an act depends on doing the most good for the most people. Bentham also believed that free markets should set wages and that collecting taxes to relieve the poor interfered with the free market. I'm not that kind of utilitarian. With these new ideas influencing the thinking of legislators, plans were made to alter the way the government dealt with poverty and disease. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 changed how the poor were provided relief. Rather than being given money and allowed to choose how to spend it themselves, those unable to find work would need to go to a workhouse where manual labor could be traded for food and clothing under what would be considered cruel prison-like conditions, with harsh discipline and separated families that encouraged child labor. The new Poor Law Amendment Act also consolidated local control of poverty relief at the parish level to larger unions overseen by the Board of Guardians. Within a year, several of the unions had to deal with riots and significant unrest. Laborers began to organize marches, and officials representing workhouses were assaulted, but the opposition was disorganized and fell apart within a few months. Some seeing an opportunity being campaigns to organize opposition. The Reverend F.H. Maberly distributed leaflets and organized meetings with as many as 2,000 attendees in an attempt to raise opposition to the new system, but ultimately failed to start a sustained movement. However, later in the 1830s, when unions began implementing the new poor law in the North, organizers experienced with opposition to factory conditions who emerged from the trade unionism and factory reform movements would later become leaders in opposition to immunizations. The leaders who emerged from the trade unionism and factory reform movements would later become leaders in opposition. Given to the unrest that followed the poor laws, as well as the generally poor understanding of the nature of smallpox immunization, it would be unsurprising that many who opposed the poor laws also opposed mandatory immunization. Not only did the methods developed in opposing the poor laws adapt to opposition to the Immunization Act, the act itself was seen by many as a salvo in a war against the poor, taking away from them the last dignity they were afforded, control over their own bodies. Alternative medical practitioners attacked the professionalizing system of medicine, both out of fear of losing the market share and because medicine at the time was hardly effective, and benefited from those elites who could afford advanced education. These practitioners led early opposition of immunization, as was the case of Gibbs' pamphlet. The circulation of pamphlet led to a letter sent by the Board of Health in 1855, compulsory vaccination, briefly considered in its scientific, religious, and political aspects. This pamphlet repeated many of Gibbs' arguments and was widely distributed. In 1866, the first organized opposition to immunization formed the Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League, or the ACVL, organized by John Gibbs' cousin, Richard Butler Gibbs, modeled on the previous reform movements. Within a few years, it had over 100 chapters. The ACVL published journals, issued membership, and of course, accepted donations. A lot of donations. A lot of donations. By the way, I did download and read the pamphlet that these people were handing out. It's interesting, the arguments that they made. So I do have their literature, not because I believe in it, but because there's no better way to get to know what other people are thinking than to pick it up. Although these organizations claim to act against immunization on the behalf of the working class, the membership was often decidedly middle class. A number of similar groups arose and began to work distributing handbills, pamphlets, photographs, magic lantern slides of vaccine moon sites, and in 1867 and early 1870s, a series of additional immunization acts were passed in response to the growing anti-immunization movement. These acts updated the process by which vaccination was to be carried out and reaffirmed that vaccination was to be compulsory. According to one history of the era, Bodily Matters, the anti-movement in England, 1850 to 1907, many Victorians looked on the anti-immunization activists as fringe cranks, lumping it with other contemporary movements. Indeed, the anti-movement activists found support in trade unions, amongst religious nonconformists, and amongst alternative medical practitioners. Immunization took on a decidedly anti-establishment character. By the 1880s, it became common amongst anti-activists to attack and harass public health officials. In 1885, the most massive march of anti-movement occurred in Leicester. A particular point of contention was the punishment being enforced to 5,000 people who had refused. Demonstrators came from many towns and cities, and many had come up for 100,000 attendees. In many towns, the growth of the population exceeded the capacity of the sanitary arrangements and drainage. After the 1872 and 1873 smallpox epidemic left over 300 people unalived, and the Vaccination Act of 1871 made vaccination compulsory, many saw the practice of immunizations as unnecessary, as it had, in their view, failed to protect those that were unalived in the epidemic. In the period leading up to the 1885 riots, over 60 residents were jailed for noncompliance with immunization, and the town developed its own method of dealing with smallpox by isolating the infected, cleaning the disinfected, or burning the clothes and bedding, similarly isolating those who had been in contact with the sick. Immunization became an issue in the municipal elections. By 1884, the immunization rate had dropped from 36% from 86% in 1873, largely due to the efforts of the anti-immunization activists. In late March, delegates from the anti-immunization leagues of over 50 towns arrived at that town. On the March 23rd, a crowd on the March 23rd. That's not me, that's the book. On March 23rd, a crowd gathered at the Temperance Hall and marched with flags and banners to the marketplace where they had heard speeches. In 1879, William Tebb, a prominent British anti-activist, visited New York City soon after the Anti-Society of America was founded. Or in other words, it went from England over to us here in the United States. The New England Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League and the Anti-Vaccine League of New York City. These groups were successful in repealing compulsory immunization laws in a number of states. In 1905, the Supreme Court ruled on Jacobson versus Massachusetts over a $5 fine imposed on a pastor who refused immunization. The court ruled that the state may restrict individual liberties if great dangers to the safety of the general public are present. A concession was made, however. Although the states could punish those who refused to immunize with fines or imprisonment, they could not forcibly immunize. The rules also required that medical exemption be made available for those for whatever reason are medically unfit to be immunized. An analogy was made to the periods of wartime, when individual liberties may be reduced in order to protect the larger community. This case marked the establishment of a legal balance between the rights of the individuals and those of the collective. By 1898, the United Kingdom, a new immunization act gave victory to anti-vaccine activists in the form of option for conscientious objectors to avoid immunization, essentially both handing a victory to the anti-immunization movement and causing a loss of interest in it. Other countries handled smallpox differently. The publication on Jenner's research coincided with a time when England was preparing to be invaded. France initially treated vaccination as a military technology that would allow soldiers to avoid sickness, but not require compulsory of the citizenry. However, and the 50,000 and 8,000 annual deaths due to smallpox in France were reduced to 1/10 of their previous level in 1850. Anti-immunization activism was by no means limited to England and the United States. In 1904, Dr. Oswald Cruz convinced the Congress in Brazil to make immunizations mandatory. The use of force to enforce the law was not well received, and the Anti-Immunization League was formed within 5 days and began recruiting. After 10 days, violence broke out and riots ensued. 30 people unalived and over 100 were injured. A general attempt to march on the presidential palace ensued. The government relented, and at least temporarily. Nevertheless, in 1908, a smallpox epidemic killed 9,000 people that lived in Rio de Janeiro. That was chapter 5. Here's the interesting thing. As I'm reading this and I'm reading the dates of my dad had me when he was older. His dad had him when he was older. Okay, my grandpa was born 1910. My great grandpa lived through this stuff that I'm reading about right now. I find it intensely fascinating to think about that. My grandpa that was born in 1910, his dad dealt with this crap. That's craziness. Craziness. That being said, I have been reading for quite a long time, and I'm ready to go and go about my day and do other things. We're at chapter 6. I'm going to put a little bookmark in there and stuff like that so I know where we're sitting. Bleep. There we go. And the next time that I go about reading this book, we'll just pop it back up to the chapter that we were on and stuff. This right here that you're I'm over on TikTok saying the book is what you see right here, Anti-Vaxxers, How to Challenge a Misinformed Movement by Jonathan Berman. If you are over on YouTube and just happen to be kind of glancing at what I'm talking about, the title page thing, the little thing that you see as far as my live will actually have the book cover on it too that you can look at. It is available on Amazon that you can get the Kindle version if you want to also read it. It has a lot of notes in there. It's got links that you can look up what they're talking about. It's got graphs, it's got charts, it's got everything that you can possibly need. There are, when I was reading, some of the pauses is I did have to rephrase some things when I was like reading it out for you guys. One, to make it flow better because the flow of the book sometimes is not that great. Two, because mods of different apps and stuff like that have different requirements that you have to do, and there are certain things I had to like shuffle around. So just to let you know that. So depending on what's going on with my day, how busy I am, or what I can do or whatnot, I may read a book. We might talk about something else. Usually me reading, not a lot of people come and join me in my lives when I read. They're not as interested in that as when they're angry and yelling at me or things like that. But, I find that the information that I can glean from these books and give to other people that want to listen and want to learn tends to help them out a little bit. So I'm hoping that the experience is beneficial to anyone that may be listening. So, and that also includes people who listen but don't click into the live. You guys too. I appreciate you all as well. Yeah. I don't think anyone's gonna be downloading me to read them books anytime soon, though. So, fun fact, I think I have the most obnoxious voice on earth. I really do. And how any of y'all listen to it for any extended period of time is absolutely beyond me. When I make videos and put them up and I listen to my voice back, I think it sounds absolutely atrocious. Horrible. Can't stand it. So, thanks. Thanks for hanging around. Well, thank you. I'm highly appreciative. Every once in a while, I get that, like, when I'm talking on the phone, like, with a family member or something, I might get, somebody that's all like, "Oh, I like it." And I kinda sit there and I'm like, "But why?" I don't like it. Some people assure me that everyone feels that way about themselves. I don't know. Yeah. I'm glad other people like it. That's nice. I don't. So, alrighty. I'm gonna go. Maybe I'll play Red Dead Redemption today. Maybe I'll go do that. That might be something. Might as well. All right. But I will see y'all later. I'm going to end over on this app first because there's not many people in there, if at all. By the way, remember that I am on YouTube and like you can watch me, like I'm simultaneously casting. I haven't figured out how to do it really good yet, but I'm working on it. So that also helps me build in other places too, just in case the kicking the can down the line thing doesn't work out for us, right? So that's in the link tree. But yeah,